Okay, let's dive into a really pivotal and honestly a pretty controversial moment in American history, the Dawes Act of 1887. Now, on paper, it was sold as this big promise, a way to help Native Americans. But the reality? Well, that was a completely different story. And this right here is the heart of the whole thing. Just imagine it. A law is passed, and the stated goal is to help a group of people. But the result? They lose 90 million acres of their land. It's a staggering number, and that's the story we're going to unpack. So you've got to be asking, how does a law with that kind of outcome even get passed? Well, it was all about this sales pitch. The act was framed as a genuine step forward, a path to progress. Let's dig into what they said it was all about. So the official goals were pretty sweeping. I mean, it was a complete cultural overhaul. First on the list, get rid of the whole idea of tribes owning land together. Then replace that with individual family farms, just like the American homesteaders. And the big overarching goal? To assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society, which really meant erasing their distinct cultures. And this quote, this really tells you everything you need to know about the thinking at the time. For the people making these policies, progress only looked one way. They didn't see tribal traditions and communal living as a valid culture. They saw it as an obstacle that was holding Native Americans back from advancing. Okay, so that was the why, at least the official justification. But how did this actually work on the ground? Let's break down the mechanics of the policy. It was a pretty methodical four-step process. First, they'd take a tribal reservation and survey it, chopping it all up. Second, individual families would get a small plot of that land. Now, here's the kicker. Step 3, all the land left over, which they called surplus, was sold off, mostly to white settlers. And finally, if you were a Native American who accepted a plot, you were granted U.S. citizenship. But, and it's a huge but, you lost your tribal protections and your tribe's sovereignty. When you see it side by side like this, the trade-off they were forcing becomes crystal clear. On one hand, you have the traditional way of life, land held by the whole tribe, self-governance and cultural protection. And on the other, the Dawes Act's offer, your own little piece of land and U.S. citizenship. But you had to give up your tribal identity and your sovereignty to get it. It was a choice between two completely different worlds. So it probably comes as no surprise that this promise of progress fell apart, and fast. The reality wasn't prosperity. For Native communities all across the country, it was absolutely devastating. 90 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. 90 million acres. That's how much land was moved out of Native American control because of this law. To give you some perspective, that's an area roughly the size of the entire state of Montana. Gone. And if the number itself is hard to grasp, this chart makes it impossible to ignore. Just look at that drop. It is staggering. What had been this huge territory of tribal lands protected by treaties was just sliced away, reduced to a tiny fraction of what it was. The main result of the act wasn't assimilation. It was a massive transfer of land and wealth. And of course, the human cost was just immense. A lot of families got plots of land that were basically impossible to farm, or they had no experience with that kind of agriculture. Breaking up the land also shattered their social structures and crippled their tribal governments. So the result wasn't a better life, it was a dramatic increase in poverty. Eventually, the damage became so undeniable that the government had to reverse course. So let's look at how the Dawes Act finally came to an end and the legacy left behind. Think about this for a second. The Dawes Act was the law of the land from 1887 all the way to 1934. That's almost 50 years. We're talking about 2 whole generations of Native Americans who lived under the system of land allotment and loss. The law that finally brought this era to a close was the Indian Reorganization Act. And this was a huge deal. It officially ended the practice of carving up tribal lands and started taking the first steps to restore tribal self-governance, a really important principle that's still central to federal policy today. Which brings us to the big, essential question that the Dawes Act leaves us with. It's a powerful lesson, and it forces us to ask, how can policies that are supposedly created with good intentions end up causing so much lasting harm? Well, the answer seems pretty clear. It happens when those policies completely ignore the culture, the rights, and the self-determination of the very people they're claiming to help. And that's a question that is still incredibly relevant today.